Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third 2023 Giller Book Club. My name's Daphna Rabinovich, and I will be your host for the remaining 11 book clubs, as well as tonight. Please make sure to have your Zoom on a side-by-side view for the best possible experience. And it is my profound pleasure tonight to introduce you to our interviewer, Kaie Kellough. Kaie is an award-winning poet, fiction writer, and sound performer. His work emerges at a crossroads of social engagement and formal experiment. His long poem, Magnetic Equator, won the 2020 Griffin Poetry Prize, and his collection of stories, Dominoes at the Crossroads, was recognized nationally and was also longlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize. Kaie has written plays for television and librettos for large musical ensembles, and his solo and group sound performances have toured internationally. Tonight, Kaie will be interviewing Rawi Hage, author of the 2022 shortlisted short story collection, Stray Dogs. And don't forget, if you have questions that you want Kaie to ask Rawi, put them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So please join me in welcoming from Montreal, Kaie, and from Vancouver, Rawi.
Thanks, Daphna. Thanks for hosting us, and thank you to everybody for being present this evening. It's great to be here with you, and thank you, Rawi, for being with us and participating in this interview. It's going to be interesting. I'm going to talk a little bit about your book, but before I do, I would like to introduce you. Rawi Hage was born in Beirut, Lebanon, and lived through 9 years of the Lebanese Civil War during the 1970s and 1980s. He immigrated to Canada in 1992 and now lives in Montreal. His first novel, De Niro's Game, won the Impact Dublin Literary Award for the best English language book published anywhere in the world in a given year, and has either won or been shortlisted for 7 other major awards and prizes, including the Scotiabank Giller Prize and the Governor General's Literary Award. Cockroach was the winner of the Paragraph Hugh MacLennan Prize for Fiction and a finalist for the Governor General's Award. It was also shortlisted for the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Award and the Giller Prize. His third novel, Carnival, told from the perspective of a taxi driver, was a finalist for the Writers Trust Award and won the Paragraph Hugh MacLennan Prize for Fiction. His work has been translated into 30 languages. So welcome, Rawi.
Thank you, Kaie. Thank you.
I'm wondering if you have a passage that you'd want to kick off this discussion with.
Yes, it's a short passage from Stray Dogs, from actually the short story by the title Stray Dogs. That's the opening of that short story. When Samir Maroof was invited to Tokyo to participate in a conference on Japanese photography, he accepted immediately. But then, sitting in his rented house in St. Paul, Minneapolis, he wondered, to whom should he break the good news? His parents in Jordan would not understand its magnitude. His father, a businessman who commuted to Saudi Arabia for work, was a chain-smoking workaholic who would be pleased at Samir's prospect for travel, but wouldn't understand the importance of the invitation to his son's academic career. Like many well-to-do Arabs, Samir had been sent to university in the United States of America so he could get a degree in business administration, then come back to the Arab world to take care of his father's business. Such a degree was also essential for his mother. She would be able to brag about her child's American education, fill a wall with his graduation picture in golden frame, gain stature in the community, meeting him at the airport alongside the entire family, and eventually find a suitable bride for her genius of a son. Samir had therefore shocked the family when he decided to change his major from business to philosophy and write a thesis on photography that would take him 3 to 5 years to finish. How would philosophy, or photography for that matter, help in the business world? Samir's father asked with alarm. He thought of photographers as either Armenians or barely one rank above the waiters at a busy wedding. To philosophize about a medium of cheap technological gadgets, to spend 3 years of one's life writing about a machine that produced an image with the touch of a finger. Why would Samir do this? He summoned his son to Jordan. Samir refused to go. His father fought with him over the phone, threatening to cut Samir's off, slamming the receivers down in heated fury. Still, Samir refused to engage. Furthermore, through his sister, Samir sent his father a message. Not only he was willing to be cut off, he'd be counted never to go back to Jordan at all. Samir's father, to make up for the anger that had come out of his mouth, smelling of Marlboro and his nightly clandestine glass of Johnny Walker, anger that had come out mixed with shouts, ice cubes, and threats, told his daughter to call her brother and ask him if he needed a good digital camera. He could send one to Samir because in Saudi Arabia, these objects were cheap and available in every mall. Samir replied via his sister that he hardly ever took photographs. And when he did, he used an old, bulky German camera that produced 6x6 negative. I mostly write about photographs, he told her. What is there to write about? She asked. Everyone can take a photo. Thank you.
That's a fantastic passage. It's funny because I read that to my partner the other night. Why Armenians?
Well, in the Middle East, I think Armenians were the first to introduce photography.
Okay.
Through their connection with Russian technology, they were known to be photographers. I think at one point, every new ethnicity takes one trade or one craft, when I start driving taxi, it was all Lebanese, then it moves to Iranians, and the latest were the Haitians in Montreal. So because I think trades get transferred from one member of the family to another. That just like, it's survival. Yeah.
So I'm going to come back to photography shortly. So there are a few questions that I would like to ask you because you're also a photographer. So I did want to ask you a few questions about that and its relationship to writing and just about your practice itself. But I've been a reader of your writer for many years now, since De Niro's Game. And so this is a rare occasion for me. And I'd like to first express my admiration for your consistency and for the consistent quality of your work. But also for the book that we'll be discussing today, Stray Dogs, which you just read from. And it seems to take your work in a different direction. Our jury discussed your book at length on several occasions, and I read it at least 3 times during and after the jury process. So I've developed a familiarity with its style, with its characters, and with the ways its stories move. But among the book's qualities that I enjoy, the first thing that stands out is the style, its spareness and its careful focus on only certain details and how those details become magnified in the reader's mind. And I've often thought that what the stories withhold is as important as the details that they offer to a reader. And I do think that's a characteristic of a writer who is advanced in their understanding of writing, is that their style needs, I think I was trying to recall a quote by Derek Walcott about this, but their style needs or has less need of ornamentation and becomes more efficient and more precise. And so in that respect, I'm very interested in how, from your perspective, your style has changed since De Niro's Game.
Yeah, it's true. I I could blame I could blame the form. It's short stories, so you have to be much more concise, obviously. But I think yes, I'm moving away from the lyrical. I don't know if that's it's being concise when you're writing short stories, or I'm getting old and maybe disillusioned with poetry. I don't know. I hope not. But I think these particular short stories, I can't help but I guess because I am writing about photography. There's an essay-like tone to them, almost academic. And I think because like any short stories, you try to convey an idea. So thought is when you trying to inject certain thoughts in writing. I think, especially in short stories, you cannot but be maybe concise. I think in this book, I tried to present many ideas through photography, and I think there's an element of classifications. I think maybe because I personally live such a fragmented life in terms linguistically, ideas, religiosity, etc. When I tried to write some kind of memoir, I thought I couldn't find any cohesion. So in a sense, I think when I classify each short stories on one theme, on one particular theme or one memory, and then bind them all in a binder in a short story, I think it creates certain cohesion, though it's just in the form of the book. I'm not answering a question, but yeah. I think maybe also that lyricism is kind of fading somehow. I don't know why. That I start. Maybe I also fear that I'm kind of getting distance in the way from the Arabic language, which was very lyrical. I've been living in the West longer than I lived in Lebanon. I've been living in the English language longer than I lived in the Arabic language. And I must admit that with time, I'm reading less in Arabic, more in French and English. Though French certainly is lyrical, but I think I'm becoming more of a North American writer. I see myself as the North American, maybe more I'm an American writer in this book.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there's still a kind of lyricism there. I mean, I guess I don't want to force you to admit that you're lyrical, but I do think that there is still, in that concision, there is a lyricism, because it's almost like the sentences sort of let some air in. There's a looseness and an ease to them, and a sort of naturalness that doesn't require ornament. And ornament can weigh things down. So there's a lyricism of even when the work is talking about something that's difficult, a topic that's difficult to approach, or a heavy topic, there's a lightness to the way it moves. And I definitely appreciate that. But I like what you said about moving away from the lyrical. You also mentioned just now a few different forms. You mentioned essay, short story, and you mentioned memoir briefly. So were you thinking about those different genres as you were working on the collection?
I think the collection is a projection of a life, because I started the first short story 20 years ago. I wrote the first short story, so it's yeah. And so the collection we gathered along the way. I think we gathered the stories, but the last 6 stories I wrote them during the pandemic. Um, I like I said, I tried to write a memoir, but I hit a wall because I realize how fragmented my life is and how fragmented my experiences are, and how my ethnic belonging is very, very complex. And coming from the Middle East, where religion is also an identity, it's also complex because, you know, I've mixed families, and that's why I try to integrate many things in these short stories, especially the last thing. There's many references to theology, something that may be very risque, and these days, and I try to have a link between the history of religion and theology and the visual. There's many references to iconoclasm, and I try to kind of maybe philosophically or historically show the big schism in the visual that happened, I think, between Greek culture and Western culture, and what I would say is Semitic culture, meaning Islam, Judaism, and Eastern Christianity. I think at one point the visual gained the upper hand because of its accessibility. I think while the West continued that tradition of the pictorial representation, etc., in the image, the East concentrated on the word itself and the written. And I think the accessibility of the pictorial won somehow, which tried to link it to that technological superiority in the West that has its root from Greek statues to iconic representation to the iPhone. So I was somewhere questioning all this, and I found myself in the midst of all these complexity and these historical consequences. So I tried to portray this in a kind of short stories, in these many stories, and I thought photography is a good medium to talk about, to cover the spectrum.
So you talked about the fragmentation of life, and as I was reading it, I was thinking a lot of, as I was reading the collection, on several occasions, I was thinking a lot about diaspora, and there were a few stories that kind of triggered that thinking. In particular, there are a few stories of return. Wave toward the end of the book is one, and there are a couple of earlier stories in the book, and the stories have a kind of international sweep, and the characters are either traveling or living abroad, and for some reason must return home. But the return is complicated. Yeah. There's distance, there's estrangement. And to focus on the opening story, about the writer who's on a residency in Germany, and he returns to Beirut at the same time as a German acquaintance goes to Beirut as a tourist. But a strange thing seems to happen when they get to Beirut. The German acquaintance appears to be more at ease and more at home than the writer, who's in the country of his birth. And it's almost like, in a way, they kind of exchange identities in the story. Would you say that that's related to that kind of sort of displacement or dislocation is related to the fragmentation you're talking about, and is a way that you chose to approach it? Yeah, definitely. I mean, that story is
it represents that complexity. Here, the character who is well rehearsed and educated in Western education since, you know, while he was still living in Lebanon. I mean, went obviously to French school and then migrated and becomes this cosmopolitan part of, you know, the elite diaspora, well rehearsed in French literature, etc., and meets a German who expect, you know, German photographer who's looking for exotic images in Lebanon, and Beirut was cosmopolitan place, has a history of this kind of well, the cliches, East and West. And I think the photographer was disappointed. And then the photographer, seeing, you know, the protagonist as someone from some certain class, he cultivated this resentment to him. It's very complex because his exotism led him to change his religion, but also to refuse, not accept the person who invited him to his country. I mean, the expectation was totally different.
So the photographer, who is German, probably Christian by birth.
Yes, atheist. Yes.
Yeah, he converts to Islam.
Yes, he does. He does convert to Islam. Yes.
Yeah.
He does convert to Islam because, and it's very, I mean, the relationship between extreme left and fundamentalism is very contradictory relationship, because they both meet on the crossroad of anti-imperialism, and I think he saw Muslim as the new proletariat, and he wanted to belong to that. And he also, because he was a failed photographer, he embraced the iconoclasm in Islam, which does not historically, does not use the image or represent the image of God. That's the theological dimension. And he was also aware, the German is also aware that the visual is part of the imperialist tools. Imperialism and the visual have a lot of commonality, or at least I think the colonial, the imperial, you know, they use images either to subdue or colonize other people. And I think the German realized that this marriage between technological advancement, image, colonialism, political upheaval has a source in the image itself. And that's when I think the main reason why he adopted Islam. There's a scene when he starts just tearing photographs. He doesn't want any photographs anymore. Yeah, it's ironic because that's a person who was leftist, radical leftist, and who embraced something that is deeply theological.
But it's getting back to the exoticism. A similar thing happens in a late story in the book, in Wave. The character, who's a professor of geology, I think, gets married, and his wife wants to go back to Beirut, and she sort of romanticizes the villagers in Lebanon, and she doesn't want anything to do with his, as she puts it. It's sort of some similar language comes up in that story as came up in the story that you're just discussing, where the woman from Quebec and the German photographer refer to their partner or friend's family in Lebanon as, you know, bourgeois. They're too bourgeois for their own tastes, and they sort of want this fantasy of the the rustic or the
Right.
and I'm wondering about that because I kind of experienced that recently in Guadalajara, traveling with some people from here, that there was a strong objection to the bourgeois cafes in a nice neighborhood, as if that was not the authentic Mexico.
Yes, 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 yes. Well, that's yes, you're ruining the the exotic experience. And I think in one of your short stories, I can't remember the title, but I remember the cousin's name was Errol. When the protagonist takes his girlfriend back to his country, though it was in a turmoil, but clearly there's a scene where you go to the cafe and everyone at the cafe is looking at your rich cousin, and clearly you stand out. You are from, those who left and made it. There's a certain antagonism and class antagonism also by the local. Return is always complicated, of course. Return is very problematic. And that's when you realize people like us, you and Kaie, I mean Kaie and me, and we realize that we don't belong anywhere anymore. That's the real tragedy of non-belonging, that metamorphosis that, and I think I detect in your writing that non-belonging, and that, that also there's another story that I really like, what is it called? I think Porcelain Nubian. That was a brilliant story where, at one point the grandson decides to sell the homes and realize, I think the whole family, the whole lineage realized that if you really want to belong, you have to also possess some physical, tangible assets and houses. And I think the houses were the sequence of the houses that finally the grandson receives. And the grandson immediately, which I love, goes and take a real estate course. I think it was brilliant because he realized that a possession is not enough. You need also knowledge to maintain that possession. So the realization that knowledge is also essential to forcibly belong. Obviously the family was excluded for a long time. So these histories, I think people like us tend to have that same experience. We understand these geographies that we live in, but the l'appartenance is always questionable.
Thank you for the complimentary reading of my work.
Brilliant book. Listen, I'm not giving. I think it's one of the best book I've read in Canadian literature and even in the world for the last 10 years. I think Dominoes at the Crossroad is a brilliant book. You're a writer's writer. I told you that before, I think, and you should take that as a compliment. There's a tempo to it. There's like the eloquence and the thought that you managed to put in short stories is just brilliant. I think you should have won the Giller, not me. You should.
What this the talk of belonging, it's one of the things that I've always kind of felt acutely is the way authenticity, authentic identity, and authentic culture is structured, and how it's impossible, I guess, at a certain point to be authentic, because when you go, quote, home, you can't be an authentic person from there because obviously you're returning.
Right.
And you've taken on the culture from elsewhere. And when you're here, you can't possibly, meet certain notions of authenticity either. So not only do you not belong, but you're fake on top of it.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the locals, I'm saying the locals, that's terrible. The Lebanese, when I go, my people. I took a taxi once, and the taxi looked at me and he said, "You don't live here, do you? You live out elsewhere, outside." I said, "Yes." "How did you know?" He said to me, "Your mannerism, you're polite." That's, it's also, there's certain, that I think these short stories also, there are about different places, and I think somehow it's a compromise for my failure to write a cohesive life story, because when you write many short stories, you can compartmentalize each aspect of your life, or each interest, or each affiliation in one story, and then you can join them in one binding. But the sad thing is, the only thing that holding them together, this fragmentation, is the physical binding, the book itself, the physicality, which I kind of like think of it as my own body that hosts so many fragments and so many geographies and interests, and the only thing that keep them together is my physicality.
I think I come from the world of poetry, so one of the challenges when writing fiction is always how to sustain consistent style over a long duration, right? I think style is one thing, particularly in this book, that holds all of those fragments together as well. Style can be cohesive too. There's a question that I want to get to. I have a lot of questions, but there's one in particular that I want to get to before, that I want to make sure to get to. So I'm going to just skip around a little bit. It's about violence, and it's a question I've thought about over reading a number of your books, that violence recurs, right? Your characters are often exposed to it. Sometimes they enact it. And one of the things that I was thinking about is that it's possible when you're reading your work, right? Violence, that violence could be a possibility. Violence could occur. It could happen. Whereas sometimes when you might be reading the work of other writers, violence is precluded as a possibility. They don't think about that. It doesn't go there. But there's violence as an opening that the work might go through. And in this book, in the story, The Whistle, I just wanted to look at the opening lines. Give me half a second. Yeah, the opening lines are, when I was 16, I convinced my cousin to chase falling bombs in the streets of Beirut with me. The objective was to get a photograph of a bomb before it reached the ground or landed on a building, on a car, or on a street, before it caused death and mayhem. The camera was his, but we shared its use. The car we drove in pursuit of falling bombs was my father's. And it's fascinating, the character's teenage pursuit of this elusive photograph of a bomb before it lands. And so I'm curious about, I guess there are multiple questions wrapped into this, but about, violence in your work and its place in your work. Yeah, and then I have another question about the image of the falling bomb afterward that I'll follow up with. But
I always thought, I always thought that literature is a criticism of life, and and we can't exclude violence from literature. Personally, I think there's no literary work if there was no, literature is about violence. violence to a certain degree. I mean, there's psychological violence that you see more in places where they're not experiencing war, or places that the violence become psychological or family stories, etc. My experience is different. I think I lived through a war, and I think I've seen it. And it's part of my history. So I think I permit myself to write about violence, because it's not something that I didn't pay for, in a way. I think I think the big question is, Simone Weil, did her look at the Homeric, the Iliad, and where she categorically condemned as a violent, epic. But on the other hand, I mean, that heroism and that violence produced also, in my opinion, great literature that was quoted by many philosophers and was the essence at the base of Greek culture. These epics, I think the Greeks understood that these are mythologies and not real, or epics, that they became part of the pedagogy. But they became about thoughts and the relationship to the gods, which determined Greek democracy. Maybe I think that beyond the violence, I think the discussion and the relation between the gods and the humans, they created these kind of extraordinary imagination, and I was going with some idea, I forgot. But anyway, I think the Greeks somehow knew that there are no gods, but had there been gods, they would have been like this. So they knew that they were imagining these gods, and they used them as a mean to bring thoughts and discussions. And I think in the context of literature, where I feel like I'm also writing mythologies, if not for this time, it may be for future generations. Violence is in our subconscious, and I think to restrain from writing with certain liberty, even with certain transgression, I think we're changing the notion of creativity. It's a very it's a question that, well, I don't write based on current morality, or I don't think that I react to world events or what is dictated by society now as what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. I think the moment I start putting restraint, or any writer puts this restraint on themselves, I think we're no longer artists. We're no longer creative people. Even people who, want some set of morality, not to represent certain things, I'm sure they have transgressional thoughts in their mind. The only difference between me and them is that I share them with the public. Mm-hmm. I'm generous enough to put them in these pages where, in my opinion, everything should be permissible. I don't think literature's job is to set moral rules. That's religion, that's legislation, that's politics. And I think the reader should know that when we write about violence or we depict violence, that's not, certainly does not mean that we are, we are encouraging violence. I mean, it's a hard question, and it's a dangerous road to take. But at least, I mean, if we want to talk about authenticity and writing without any restraint, which is in a way, I think every artist think this is a gift. It's not a way to shape society, but to give, to present options, to present complexity. And I think if we start exposing kids or people to the complexity of life, hopefully that would lead to tolerance. I think when we start seeing humans in all their misdeed and greatness and poetry, that create different kind of perceptions about each other, hopefully.
On that note, I'd like to talk about some of your own the complexities and the variety in your own artistic practice. But before I do, I would like to remind the audience to use the Q&A function if you have a question. So you can throw it up in the Q&A, and once we get to that, that's where I will draw your questions from. Otherwise, they will be invisible. You're also a photographer. Your work is collected in galleries, major galleries in Quebec. I'm wondering if you can, one of the things that I find interesting about short stories is that you can write a short story based on an image. Like if you see an image in your mind, or you can construct a short story around it. You can't construct a novel around it. But a short story can be built around one static image. Like just because the brevity that the form allows will permit that. So I'm wondering, how does photography inform your writing? You did talk about that a little bit earlier, but if you could elaborate on that a little bit, I would love to hear more about that. How do you see sort of some of the parallels between the photographic image and the short story?
I think my approach what photography taught me is to observe things, and to turn object into living things, into the spatial that I thought I use in my writing sometimes. And I always feel that I am in the scene. I'm present, much like a photographer with a camera, where you point at things. One thing about photography is, well, before the new technology of drones, etc., a photographer has to be in place. You have to be physically there. And the same thing, maybe like theater, you have to be there. There's a physicality, there's a presence that I feel in every scene, as if I'm there. I was very comfortable first to write in the first person, I guess because I always imagined myself there and describing many things. I think photography taught me how to be distant, but also observant and present at the same time. There's a neutrality, maybe, to a photographer. When you're a photographer, you're supposed to be kind of discreet or non-interfering. You're just there to record the passage of time or an image. And I think writers are the same way. We tend to be there, but at the same time, we don't want to be seen as part of. That's the narrator's job, is not to be too conspicuous, not to be present. And I think that's the relation between writing and photography. But also, but also, listen, I'm gonna say something about a scene in your book that I love. Also, I'm coming back. Let that be an exchange. It's okay. And there's a scene of when he stands in the museum and he looks at that famous painting of, I think, General
Death of General
Wolfe. Yes. And I know that painting. I know because I know the history of that painting. In a battle, in a ship battle, he was sniped and he was killed. But what you did is, instead of concentrating on the personage of this heroic personage, you know, a general that all the powers kind of converge in that person, you wondered at the people around him. What happened to them? Where did they go? And you kind of laconically imagined their lives. You know, I think that, and you liberated them, you broke the frame, and you took these personages and you gave them a different lives. Some, I'm sure that, you know, they went to tropical places, and what I see as some kind of inevitable métissage. Some, you know, held other jobs. So that, I think, you started from an image and you spread it, and you became the writer who imagines alternative stories and a collection of stories. And I think we all operate on that same way. I think an image can be a start to something, but also I think how also there's a political view about this. The concentration of this imperial power was shattered. Once there was a defeat, the admiral was defeated. Well, he wasn't defeated, they won the battle, but he won his death, disrupted everything. And I think that's what we do as writers. We kind of observe and see how we can expand and imagine things that are credible, maybe not true, but credible nevertheless, and based on historical facts that we know. So it's a combination of many things. And I think also my approach to the visual in the work is that it's how you can see beyond the objects, how you take these scenes and you expand them. So in a way, we're expansionist, not in the political sense, but we are.
in the mind.
Not in imperial sense, but
yes,
you know.
yes, yeah. Okay, Rawi, I have a couple of audience questions for you. I have a host of my own questions as well, still. So hopefully this conversation can continue beyond the borders of this discussion. But one question was, I'll just roll them together. So the first question was from Kuheli Chatterjee, was to tell the audience something about your workspace. What does it look like? You know, what are the conditions of your writing life when you need to sit down and get it done? And then another question, a second question, was about the title of the collection, Stray Dogs. If you could tell us a little bit about how you chose that.
I like that short stories because it refers to my favorite photographers, Taidu and Kudelka, and they both come from, one is a European photographer and one is a Japanese photographer, but they both photographed dogs, stray dogs, independently. None, you know, I don't think they even knew of each other at the time. I'm talking 60s, 70s. And both dogs looked menacing. And they're both stray dogs. And in that short story, you know, that's the passage that I read, where Samir Maruf makes a comparison between the two cultures, and with references to Buddhism and Christianity, the image of a devil and the aesthetics of the sharp black and white that is characteristic of Japanese. It was shocking at the time, Japanese aesthetics in photography. I think it has its influence comes straight from the No theater, the Japanese No theater, where it's harsh lights, very austere, very little movements. So it's they took that technology, but they didn't lose their cultural traits, Japanese. And Kudelka. Stray Dogs is reference to these two stray dogs, but also I figured maybe in a symbolic way, I feel like all my characters are stray, people who have no homes. They're wanderers to a certain extent. What was your other question?
Well, the other question was about it was about your writing space.
I need complete isolation, very antisocial, and I need to be in spaces very quiet and where there's no humans, nobody around me. And it's kind of seclusion. It's very hermetic the way I write. I need dark spaces where there's nobody, but it's hard because I suffer from the dropping of water, the fridge, the humming of that you cannot. I become neurotic because sometimes I rent a place and then you discover that there's a humming, undefined humming. I remember that I realized that the humming is coming from the heater, so I turned off the heat. And I was writing in complete cold in Montreal because I'm a bit neurotic about sound when I'm writing. I have to hear my own self and nothing else. I have to hear my own musicality. So it's hard to find very, very quiet places. But
I want to add something about the strays. I think of roaming, and there's something there. Is there also a freedom, a freedom to being untethered, a freedom to roam, a freedom from being domesticated, a freedom from being perhaps broken, even in being a stray?
Yes, I think there's definitely that. I think every true artist seek that, but that's a tragic too. There come a point where solitude surface, and it's not because you're not surrounded with people, but because you don't know how to relate in a way to social buzziness. It's a skill. What I watch sometimes? I watch Netflix Blinks, which is kind of really, about rich people spending their money, very superficial things. And I admire them because they have a communication that is very foreign to me. And they speak a lot. They're loquacious. And they're smart in a certain way. They're not intellectuals. They're not thinkers. But I think the practice of constantly being social makes them courageous in public spaces, makes them confident, make them, and they're always surrounded. They're devious, they're smart, they know how to make money, they're very superficial. I don't want to hang out with them, but they have skills of communications that people who choose different lives find it very hard. And that's the real, I'm finding with age that's the real price. You cornered yourself in order to produce. That's the I think every real writer, real artist, that's the vow that we took. It's almost religious. We took the vow of eliminating many things in life and embracing solitude in order to produce, because we knew That's the only way you can be meaningful through producing. It's a question of distractions. So it's very hermetic. It's almost religious calling. But in the process, at one point, you realize that you're alone and you don't have the skill to to belong, because belonging is also a practice. You have to maintain it too. It's like cultivating a plant. It's not something that comes. So that's the trade-off, I think.
I'd like to interject with one quick question from our audience. This is an interesting question. So, question is basically, to paraphrase from an anonymous attendee, how to write authentically about people how to people who are interesting, who you might know, how to characterize them in a detailed way. And still maintain a degree of acceptance and respect. So is the goal being not to hurt or embarrass, yet authentic? How do you balance those things?
Yeah, you can transform them and base certain things and clearly make it, at least for them and for yourself, that you all also playing the game of metamorphosis. You take them and you integrate many things in them. But I don't know if people, I have a cousin who always tells me, "Why don't you write about me?" I said, "If I write about you, I'm gonna present you like shit, man. Like I'm gonna massacre you." He said, "I don't mind, do that. Just write about me." So it depends, but I think that's it's always a risk. It's always a risk. I wrote a short story about mother, which is brutal, and I didn't present the mother I present her as a tragic, but it's not in a flattering way, right? But it's element of my mother's. It's not completely my mother. I don't know if she read it. If she would read it, she would recognize herself or not. I don't think she would recognize herself.
I still find that characterization sympathetic, though. It's not eviscerating or anything like that. It is, I mean, it shines kind of a clear light, right? Maybe too clear at times, but it's not, but it's still somehow sympathetic. We've got a couple of minutes left, and so this is the time where I've been, I've been reminded to ask you about if you have any reading recommendations for people, and for me. What are you reading?
Oh, I'm reading St. Augustine.
Oh, okay.
It's not recommended. I'm reading it because I'm struggling with writing my own memoir, or like biography or autobiography. I'm struggling with that. So I'm reading St. Augustine, but I like the transition, his transition from Manichaeans to, but it also tells you the question of time. I find an uncompromising man. I mean, like most religions are. I think I find him. I don't necessarily agree with his orthodoxy. I don't agree with his orthodoxy. But it also shows how people on the periphery of Rome and their relation to Rome, how they were living. Because North Africa was, Carthage was a Roman state. And when they go to Rome, how they encounter It's a writing about what you find pretty much in Quebec writing about what is called le terroir, people who comes from the periphery to the cities. And they tend to be, they tend to have something that they always bring to the cities. And I think these our city get rejuvenated, much more like Canada and the immigrant story on a different scale. What they bring is certain authenticity and fraternity. He never traveled alone. He always traveled with his mother. When they went to Rome, he went with his mother and friends, and they lived in the same room. And you know, it was a big deal for him to get education. So I think it's an immigrant story for me. You take whatever you want. I mean, obviously, people, as an atheist, people get shocked, you know, and my friends, Madeline was shocked that I'm reading St. Augustine, and she knows my, you know, my position on religion. But I have an interest in theology. That's, you know, I think you take whatever you want from your reading.
Well, thank you for the recommendation and for the way you explained it. So for those who may have been daunted by that, now you've smoothed the way in for them. So thank you. Rawi, it's been a pleasure interviewing you. And
pleasure, Kaie.
And hopefully we can do this again.
Come for dinner. We're both Montrealers.
I would love to.
Okay, great.
Well, I expect to be invited to that as well.
Oh, then you're definitely invited, and your whole family, especially your mother.
Well, thank you so much, Kaie and Rawi. It was a brilliant hour, both with the questions and your very, very generous answers, Rawi. So thank you very much. I hope everybody who is listening tonight enjoyed it as much as I did. And if you know people who were not able to join us for this fabulous hour, it will be available on our YouTube channel in the next few days. And I hope that you will also join us in 2 weeks' time when we have another past juror, Kaie Plett, who will be interviewing Kim Fu about her novel, Lesser Known Monsters of the 21st Century. All of the information for registration can be found on our website, and I look forward to seeing you at that time. Again, thank you, Rawi. Thanks, Kaie, and good night or good afternoon for the West Coast.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye, Kaie. See you soon.
See you soon.
Bye.